Hi, Julia.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for having me. This is such a small world.
God, my pleasure. I'm really excited to talk to you because I was really touched by the essay that you wrote, which is in your,
Mm.
obviously you're interested in this conversation and creating
Hmm.
a conversation around this topic. So I'm was just so excited to speak with you. First and foremost, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Okay, sure. My name is Julia Turshen. I am a cookbook author. I host a podcast and I am a very proud home cook. And yeah, I don't know what else to say. It's
That's
kind of,
perfect.
that's sort of it. Yeah.
Well, I'm really like especially excited to talk to you because I've never had a conversation for this series with a cook or with someone who
Hmm.
cooks for a living,
Interesting. Yeah.
which I think is really interesting
Yeah.
because there is a very complicated relationship between fat people when it comes to food and the idea of loving food. This cookbook that you just came out with is about healthy comfort food.
Hmm.
So, how do you define healthy comfort food?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you first how I don't define,
Please.
which is to say, yeah, I wrote a book about a cookbook with recipes for healthy comfort food, and it has nothing at all to do with weight loss. And that pretty much, I think, sums it up. I mean, I think it's really interesting to me how unusual that is. And, I think healthy, especially within cookbooks and food media, and honestly just like food packaging, like the word healthy that appears on like food you're buying or on a menu, like anywhere where there are words describing food when the word healthy is used, my experience has been that it's pretty much always been misused, and it's a way of just saying skinny.
Yeah.
And I wanted to write a cookbook that did not equate health with thinness,
Mhm.
because they're not the same. So, in terms of how do I define healthy, how do I define healthy comfort? For me, it's totally about just how I feel when I'm cooking and eating. It's my relationship to food, both as a maker of it, as a cook, and an eater of it. And it is for me at this point in my life, I will say I'm really, really happy that every day, like the best way I can describe my relationship with myself, with my body, is just an increasingly free one. For
Mhm.
me, healthy has everything to do with freedom, and freedom from guilt and restriction and deprivation, freedom from judgment, most of all, I would say, and just freedom from all of it just weighing on us, no pun
No pun
intended,
intended.
just
Yeah.
feeling a bit more free around it. So that's definitely how I think about it. And yeah, it has nothing to do with like calories or what I'm eating at all. It's just about how do I feel?
I'm assuming that that is probably like a feeling that has evolved over the years.
Yes. Yeah.
Because I remember like when I was much younger, always thinking fat is bad
Hmm.
and you can either be fat or healthy, right?
Yeah.
And then there's what is the in between, but then over the years, and you do talk about this in your essay too, like you bought this emotions poster, right? And
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
refer to having to know yourself and having to
Hmm.
learn how to get to know yourself better is something that fat people really have to experience from a young age, just because there are so many complex emotions that happen. I also assume that like cooking has probably helped you like heal through a lot of those traumas that you've had with your body. I know for me, I had mentioned to you, like I have a challah business now, and through talking about eating bread, I've healed a lot of that of like,
Mm.
it's okay for me to eat the bread. And
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
bread isn't what's bad for me. It's like everyone else's ideas around bread is what's bad.
Yeah, I've been working on something that is about exactly this. So it's really interesting to talk to you about, because I don't know if you know this about my mom, but my mom grew up in a bread bakery. Her parents ran a bakery in Brooklyn, and I never knew those grandparents, but my grandparents came from the same business. My grandmother's father ran a bakery like in the old country, and my grandfather's father was a flour miller's son. That's how they met. So bread is like very important to my family, right? And it also was something I used to be so scared of, because I grew up with very similar ideas, I guess, around fatness and definitely was taught and was shown that, the less space you take up, the more valuable you are. So it meant that this thing that my family has such an attachment to, bread, which most people around the world have some attachment to, it was something we loved because bread is obviously the best thing in the world. It's so
Yeah.
good. Um, and it was also something we feared and just
Mhm.
lived in fear of. And I have been kind of working through this, my whole life. And but yeah, I've been like working on kind of a story about just this and like learning not to be scared of bread. And so it's really interesting to know about the work you've been doing and what it's, helped you work through. So for me, cooking in some ways has definitely helped me heal my relationship with food, but I think it's also given me a lot of control over food in ways that I don't know that it's always been healing. Like as a cookbook author, I measure things for a living, right? And that is actually really, I'm finding, is like not something I really want to continue doing because measuring food in any way is just a total trigger for me. I was like on and off of Weight Watchers for like over a decade, and I'm pretty sick of measuring food. And
Oh,
like, but I also love writing recipes and I love helping people feel really comfortable in their kitchen. And I can still write recipes and maybe have less of a emotional feeling about the measurements. Or I can also help people learn to cook in other ways too. Like, I don't know. I just am like working through all this. And I would say one thing that I feel like is important to share based on what you brought up is something that's been really, really helpful for me in navigating this thing we're talking about that I think we've both been navigating. And it sounds like many people you're talking to have been navigating, which is just diet culture, right? Like,
yeah.
what is it? How do we not participate in it? And for me, because I've had this lifelong love of cooking,
Mhm.
but I've also had such a hard relationship with my body and issues around body image and stuff. It's been really confusing for me because I feel like, wait, I love food.
Right.
I'm so curious about food. I feel so confident when I'm cooking. I feel so great. Like food is wonderful.
Mhm.
And at the same time, I've been like, wait, food is what makes you fat, and that's the thing you don't want to be, and that's the thing I've been told not to be, and I'm scared of what I'm eating, and I feel guilty, and I feel shame. So it's been incredibly confusing for me because it's not been all good or all bad. And just understanding the distinction between cooking and eating,
Mhm.
I mean, that's probably like really clear to other people, but for me, it wasn't so clear. And just separating those two, even though they obviously have so much to do with each other, has just been helpful because, yes, I've loved to cook and I've had a fraught relationship with my body, and both those things have existed at the same time. And there's also a version of my life that I feel like I'm living now, and I'm so grateful to, where I can be just as happy when I'm eating as I am when I'm cooking.
Cooking must be an outlet for you in some sense.
Oh,
But
yeah.
and food also, just like the creativity that comes with cooking and coming up with recipes and all those things. But I think a lot of fat people also have any anxieties when it comes to food. So almost like the opposite approach,
Hmm.
or opposite relationship, that you've like used food as an outlet. Like food can be like this really scary thing that it's like, oh God, like I don't want to learn how to cook because,
Hmm.
I don't want people to like judge me for being a fat person who likes to cook. Or
Mhm, mhm,
just, the idea of loving food as
mhm.
a fat person is like something that like you can't really admit. I mean, you kind of mentioned it, right? Like of having to separate those two things to not feel scared of food. But there are a lot of like food fears too.
While I've lived with a lot of fraught feelings about my body, like, I've always lived in, I guess, what I understand to be, like, a straight-sized
Yeah.
body, and, like, I do not, nor have I ever lived in what I would understand to be, like, a very fat body, so I think my experiences just come with a lot more privilege than others. Like, I do not live in the most oppressed type of body. I'm also white, which changes things. Like, I also only know what it is to live in my body. No one else is, so I can only speak to my experience. But I just want to share a little bit more information about how my body moves through the world. It's something that's been really helpful for me, which came at the encouragement of my therapist, is just something I've done in the past is like basically immediately believe whatever voice in my head is telling me, like whatever it's telling me, I've believed it. Like I haven't questioned it. And stopping and pausing and just being curious. And that has been huge for me. It almost always, in that moment, I'm like, oh, this is just diet culture. This is like,
Mhm.
you were taught this from such an early age by like everyone in your life, not just like my family, like the world, like media and everything. Like,
Right.
so that's going to have like a really strong grip. And right now it's like holding on, like that's what's happening. So just in those moments, shifting from being anxious to just trying to be curious has been really helpful. Like noticing my anxiety, like
Right.
observing it, like
Right.
that is really helpful. And it kind of goes back to that poster thing, which was just something I did and I continue to use it. That's just been really, really helpful for me. And basically I bought an emotions poster from like a school supply website. I mean, you could probably get it anywhere online. And, it's like, I think it's like 15 or 20 like different emotions or feelings. And there's like a picture of a kid next to each one, like making the face of it. And, you said earlier that I think, or at least what I heard you say, it was like when you were growing up, you thought you could be healthy or you could be fat. And I felt that way too. And I also, for so long, felt like the only two feelings I had experienced were being happy or being fat.
Mhm.
And understanding one, that fat is not a feeling. like
Right.
I was just incorrect. Like, oh, this is not a feeling.
Right.
Like it's a way to describe the size of something. Like that's not a
Right.
feeling.
Right.
And I didn't know it wasn't a feeling, and no one asked me to describe
Yeah.
what I was actually feeling because everyone I was around was saying the same thing all the time. Like it was very accepted. And it changed for me when I started spending time with someone who just doesn't identify it as a feeling, and that is my wife Grace, who is amazing. And just I would not be having this conversation with you had it not been for her essentially asking me just to tell her what I was actually feeling. Like
Right.
it's that simple, but it's that profound. And I didn't have the answer for her. Like every time I was like, oh, I feel so fat, and she'd be like, well, not a feeling. So like, what are you actually feeling? And I would have nothing to say because I had no idea what I was feeling. I just knew I wasn't feeling good. So one, I confused fat with being a feeling. And two, I had basically made it a word that meant anything other than good, which meant I couldn't, even though it's not a feeling, I couldn't feel fat and good or happy at the same time.
Mhm.
So when you're saying like growing up feeling like, oh, you could be fat or healthy, like you couldn't be both. Like I feel the same thing about happy. Like you could feel fat or you could feel happy, but you can't feel both. So yeah, in the moments where I'm like, oh, I'm feeling fat, I go stand in front of the poster and I'm like, okay, Julia, like what are you actually feeling? And
What do you
I
really
am
feel?
very helped by having like a visual
Yeah.
aid. Yeah, the poster's been really helpful. I
That's
recommend it.
hilarious.
I
I
love
know.
it. Yeah.
Oh my God. I know. I gotta get a poster. It's so funny. It's simple. Like it's right. When you like have to train yourself to become a kid again, you're like,
Yeah.
oh, things make more sense now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask you, when you were growing up, what was your experience like moving in your body? Were you bullied in school?
Hmm.
Were you, uh, what was the conversation around food growing up, eating at home? Your friends, what did they look like? Did you ever have, people you could talk to about it? Like, what was that
Yeah.
experience?
I honestly, like in retrospect, when I think back, I definitely was bullied for my body but it wasn't at school. It was definitely like within my family, which is hard. And also, I think the people bullying me were also bullying themselves. So it's been interesting for me to just see that more clearly as an adult, like both the fact that they were doing it to themselves, but also like it wasn't happening to me at school, or at least not to my face. Like not that I know of. Like maybe it was, but whatever. Um,
I'm just going to interrupt you. I think that's really
please.
important because I have a similar experience to that. And I feel like a lot of the time family members will kind of try to, like with fat kids, kind of be like, I want to protect you, right? I don't
Mhm.
want you to get bullied at school. I don't want your peers to make fun of you. I don't want you to have a hard time when you have to go find a job, right? And similar to you, like I didn't experience it like externally at school either. And
Mhm.
I was always just very confused and like, am I supposed to feel bad about myself? Like I'm not
Mhm.
feeling bad about myself. But now I might be, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just a total mind fuck. Like,
Absolutely.
and for me, I mean, I had internalized so much of the bullying. I think
Mhm.
it's hard not to. And so that meant that at places like school and
Right.
summer camp, like the places where I spent a lot of time as a young person, outside of my family, I had internalized that bullying so much and that just shame about my body to the point where I think I was walking around with such a wall up,
Mhm.
and I was, I don't know, I feel really fortunate in so many ways because I really did have such positive experiences with my peer groups. And I had like one or two close friends who, in retrospect, I was like, oh, I wasn't telling them anything. Like, I think sometimes I hear myself being like, I didn't have any close friends. And I feel like that belittles the friendships I did have. And I don't want to do that. But I know that there was a lot I wasn't sharing because I didn't know how to share it. And I was like in pain about a lot of it. And I think the best way to describe who I was as like a young person, I mean, this is going to sound really like ego-y, but it just is the truth. But so I was student body president of my school, but I didn't go, you were too? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Um,
And you
but
know what's really interesting? Somebody else that I spoke to on this podcast was too. And I think that
it makes sense to me.
it makes sense, right?
Yeah, I held that role. But I also never went to prom.
Mhm.
So I think I put myself in a position, I don't know, where I was like respected, but I wasn't vulnerable with anyone, including myself. Like I think I put up those walls so much because I had internalized so much of the bullying. So, in terms of like movement and stuff, like I think as a young kid and like through middle school, I was like really active and I played a lot of sports. And then I basically stopped in high school because to me, I mean, one, my freshman year of high school, I remember I had like gained like a significant amount of weight and I was like really self conscious. And I have always been a pretty strong person and in many ways physically like pretty fearless. Like I would play like goalie because I didn't care if something was coming flying at me. Like um but I never had great like stamina. Like part of why I was like, I'll be goalie and let these objects fly at me
Right.
because then it meant I could run less.
Right.
Like I'll take the hit if I don't have to be out of breath. I feel like come like, ninth grade or something, I had gained weight. So I felt like it was easy for me to get out of breath. And that made me feel really self-conscious. And I also like remember like uniforms for sports teams, like they would have to order me like a different size and
Right.
like,
Right.
something without sleeves would be really hard for me. Like I just felt so uncomfortable and self-conscious. And it also just got a lot more competitive. Like it used to be fun. And then all of a sudden it became competitive. And
Mhm.
I don't know, I sort of like excused myself from that. And I got involved in student government where I could still feel like active,
Mhm.
maybe not so much physically, but I could feel part of something.
Yeah.
And I also like, you know, it didn't have anything to do with my body.
You talked about the uniforms and the different sizes, right? And
Mhm,
a lot of these conversations, I'm finding that just talking about these experiences for thin bodied people is like kind of an awakening, right?
mhm,
Just to learn through telling these stories and through having these conversations. Something as simple as like needing to order a size extra large t-shirt is like
mhm.
horrifying when you're 16 years old and you're
Yeah.
so impressionable.
And like, I also just, I don't know, I spend a lot of time, obviously, a lot of time thinking about the stuff and
Mhm,
navigating it personally.
mhm.
And I also am trying increasingly to understand, like, oh, if this was what it was like for me,
Yeah,
imagine what it was like for someone who
yeah,
didn't, I was wearing whatever. I don't need to like give sizes, but I was wearing like larger sizes than like the girls on my team. But like, there are girls and women who need
absolutely.
other sizes. Like, what was it like for them? And this stuff is just really hard. And I think one of the things that is most just upsetting to me about diet culture is that, at least for me, when I think about these things we're talking about, like I'm cool talking about them now. I've like thought about it a lot, like I've processed a lot, but like when I picture myself in these moments, they were very quiet,
Mhm.
like isolated moments where I just felt so alone. Like I was not someone who was like turning to my friend on the team being like making a joke out of like the like men's whatever size they had to order me, and I wasn't, and no one on the team was saying anything to like, I tried to hide in those moments and I felt so lonely. And I again can only imagine if that's how I felt, how would someone in a larger body in our culture feel? And I just am learning as like an adult, talking about the stuff, talking about it like with you, like we've never spoken before, and I feel like I'm like, I really understand you. I feel like you understand me. Like I don't feel so lonely. And it's something that just breaks my heart about diet culture is like it isolates us and it makes us, or it's made me just feel so lonely at times. And like that is just so sad. All the stuff we're talking about, I'm sure anyone who's, you know, who's kind enough to like listen, like I'm sure there's a lot of people like nodding, right? Like we are so not alone in this, but like we don't talk about it, right? So like we feel so alone.
Absolutely. I think
That's why it's great you're doing this.
well, thank you. And that's why I'm so happy to have you. I so appreciate it, but I can really relate to that. I mean, when I put out like my first episode of this series, it was really scary because
Mm,
I had never talked about this publicly ever.
mhm,
I've talked about it with my therapist. I've talked about it
mhm.
with my parents, just like you guys like this is why you can't say certain things to me. And
Yeah.
like I feel badly about myself. And I've told like I would say a very small handful of friends.
Mhm,
After a few of these conversations, like it just blew my mind how similar everyone's story is
mhm.
and how not alone we are.
Yeah.
And that is when I actually became comfortable with talking about it
Mm,
more and more, is like I was able to heal and begin this journey only through publicly like talking about this
yeah.
and hearing other people's stories and building that community and realizing like we're not the problem. It's
Mhm.
everybody else is the problem.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that. And it's really interesting too, like the rise of Instagram, obviously, and the internet and finding those kind of pockets of community for fat people. I never had that growing up.
Mhm,
And that always made me really upset. Like, just like going through 17 magazine and seeing like thin women, thin girls in
mhm.
bikinis and like how to lose weight before the summer and
Yeah.
all of those things. Like there was not a fat person in sight. And I'm so grateful that now, plus size models are much more like normalized. And,
Mhm,
you said this, and I think it's another really important point, right? Like I consider myself fat. Doctors consider me fat.
mhm,
Clothing stores consider me fat because I don't fit into clothes at
mhm,
stores. But I can only imagine that the struggle for people who are much larger than me,
mhm.
who can't even look at a plus size model and see themselves in
Yeah.
that, like that, that's a completely different experience that I don't have. That can only be harder.
Are you familiar with, Aubrey Gordon's work?
Yeah, well, I listened to your podcast with her, which I thought
Okay,
was great, and I did a little digging on her, and she's
awesome.
pretty
She's
profound.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so she, I guess, yeah, for anyone listening or watching who doesn't know, she, on social media, her handle is Your Fat Friend, and she's been writing, like, anonymously for a while, but then she came out with a book, a few months ago
Mhm.
called What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, and it's, like, an amazing book, and she hosts this amazing, amazing podcast I cannot recommend highly enough called Maintenance Phase. It's so good. And I got to interview her, and something I've learned from her work and in talking to her was like how often fat people, and especially very fat people, are talked about and not spoken to, or like let alone heard. And it's like,
They're not part of the conversation.
yeah. So
Yeah,
it's like, yeah, I mean, I can't speak to what it is to, you
right.
know, be in middle school or high school or summer camp or whatever, like in a very fat body. I can just tell you about my experience, and I can know that my experience was valid and
Right.
is whatever it was, but also like I think good to remember there's other experiences, and I would like to know more about those. And that's why I kind of seek out that kind of work and other just friends and people to follow on social media and stuff, because I think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier. Like for so long, I just would go around being like, whether it was in my head or out loud, like, oh, I feel so fat. And
Yeah,
everyone around me was saying the same thing. So of course it wasn't challenged,
right.
like, or just asked about. And it's like, yeah, if you change who you're saying things to, like the response might change.
Yeah. But it's so fascinating to me because a lot of like my friends who I grew up with, they were thin. They were
Mhm.
really like thin, conventionally beautiful girls.
Mhm.
And when I've mentioned like kind of seeing them watching these conversations
Mm.
has been very interesting to me where they're like, Wait, what? Oh, you have to think about I don't know, it could be anything. You have to think about, like, the way that you're sitting in a room at work. You have to
Mhm.
whatever it is, like, yeah, that's what it feels
Mhm.
like every day.
Yeah. Yeah. How is it going, if I may ask,
Yeah.
with your family? Are they watching or listening?
Yes, my family is watching. I think that I've also kind of built boundaries as I've
Yeah.
grown up around, like, things that I just you can't talk to me about.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah. Same.
So, like, I don't wanna hear what you have to say about my appearance, whether it's something, that you consider positive. I just don't wanna hear it.
Mhm.
I don't want to hear that you think I look thin today, that I look good, like, because
Mhm.
going back to what you said in the beginning, like, thin doesn't equate with good. Fat doesn't equate with bad. Like, I want to live my life not having to think about what I look like every day because it just takes up space. And
Mhm.
I could be doing so many other things. And so much has been just clogged with thinking
Mhm.
about my body. And I have learned to create more space for
Yeah.
other great things and productivity and people and relationships that
Mhm.
I've never been able to before.
Yeah.
It's just been so cloudy.
Yeah. I'm with you, and I'm just really with you, and I'm trying to fill that space with more rest and not with more things. Like, I think that part of, diet culture intersects with so many other things like racism and classism and all this stuff. And I feel like productivity, or like the push for it, is
Mhm.
part of all these things. And I find that too, like, oh, I think about the time and energy and money I have spent trying to take up less space.
Mhm.
If I start thinking about that, like, I get really upset,
Me
like,
too. Yeah.
because I mean, just so much wasted time, energy, and money, like dollars. And I think when I try to remove myself from diet culture, push against it, often my instinct is like, what could I have done with that money? What could I have done with that time? Like, and lately I'm like, what if I just took naps? Like, what if I just watched TV during all that time? Like, I think for me, a lot of weight stuff is tied to it has a lot to do with the idea of being like lazy
Mhm.
and like not productive. And like for me and my family, fat phobia is very tied to like workaholism.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I'm not succeeding so much with the following, but I'm really just trying to think about like, oh, what would it look like if you just rested instead of put in all this effort? Like, still do everything else you're doing, but don't try to replace this with something else. Like,
Totally.
yeah.
That's huge because I think that there's also like an overcompensation that's going on with
Hmm.
fat people, right? Of like, yeah, like, oh God, I don't want people. I mean, I felt this way. Like, I don't want people to think that I'm lazy because of the way that I look.
Student body president.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So I'm going to do all these things.
Yeah.
I'm going to make sure that I'm excelling and successful in all these different areas because I have to prove to both myself and to you that
Hmm.
I'm very capable, that I can
Yeah.
be successful, that I can be productive, that I am
Yeah.
not this stereotype of this fat person laying
Yeah.
on the couch eating potato chips all day. Just as I get older and I just continue to grow, like it's so interesting because I really at times like I feel grateful for my experience in my fat body because it's really pushed me in ways that I may not have been pushed
Mm.
otherwise.
Mhm.
I am who I am because of those
Mhm.
things. That's my silver lining in all
Yeah,
of
yeah. Yeah, I feel like you're like the voice in my head. I get it. It's just
yeah,
it's also like I feel like also it sounds like things you experience, things I experienced, like, were really hard, like, and it sucks. And like,
yeah.
yeah, I feel like we can definitely, I think, both pull a lot of silver linings, but I think also okay to acknowledge like, yeah, that sucked.
Yeah, and especially like as a kid too, like there was one conversation I had with someone where she just said like it's a shame because I lost my childhood to diet.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that like that breaks my heart and I can so relate to that. Like,
Yeah.
in high school I did Weight Watchers 3
Hmm.
times. I did Jenny Craig. I
Hmm.
did Atkins. I did everything instead of just enjoying my childhood and that's
Yeah.
gone. And
Yeah.
when I look back at those memories that I have as a kid, like they are tainted with this
Yeah.
narrative of
Yeah.
you were fat.
Yeah.
You couldn't just enjoy. And that's really sad. That's
Yeah. Yeah. And I just think like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like for me, it's like something I'm working on is like grieving that loss. Like there's
yeah.
grief with that. Yeah.
I don't know. And I don't know. I'm curious because I know on your podcast you always ask people what did they eat growing up?
Yeah.
I want to know what you enjoyed eating.
So sweet. Yeah, it's really interesting. I find whenever I talk about this stuff, which it's so funny. It's like I'm so happy to be having this conversation. I'm really happy to be having it, though it's so serious and has
Yeah.
felt very sad at points. Like I'm so happy we're talking about this. And it's also not like a fun conversation. And I think there's versions of conversations about fatness and fat phobia and stuff that can be fun. But I just noticed that. And I think this is a really serious topic and one to be taken seriously and thoughtfully. But also, I appreciate being able to talk about like a really fun memory of food too, because it's
Yeah.
all wrapped up with each other, right? So, yeah, I always ask everyone their favorite thing to eat when they were growing up, and I always like asking it because answering it is so hard.
Yeah.
Because, oh my gosh, so I like to eat so many things, and I thought that that was not good, and now I'm like, oh wow, like you have found pleasure in so many foods, like that's cool. So one that immediately comes to mind is I have an older brother and we were raised by our mom and dad, and then also very much by Jenny, who's our babysitter for like over a decade. And Jenny continues to be absolutely part of my family and someone I speak to all the time, and we're still super close. And a lot of my happy memories around my body and around food are really take place with Jenny. And um, so a lot of the foods that she would make, that she still makes, that like to me are just some of my favorite like childhood comfort foods. So Jenny's from St. Vincent, which is a small like island nation in the Caribbean, and she makes her chicken pilau, which is like a one pot chicken and rice
Mhm.
thing. It is so good, and I don't know. I've like watched her make it. So I ate it all the time as a kid, like loved it. And then as I got older and started working on cookbooks, I was like, I gotta learn how to make this, like really learn. Cause she would often make it when I wasn't home. So
Mm,
I would eat it, but I didn't get to see it made.
right.
So as an adult, I started like sometimes I'd be at Jenny's apartment and I was like, I'll bring the ingredients, tell me what you need. And like I'm gonna bring my notepad.
Uh-huh.
And I watched her make it many times and I like wrote it down. Like this is what I do for a living, right? Like I took
Yeah.
videos on my phone and everything. And I still like cannot make it as good as she does. And I think I never will, right? Like
Of course.
it's because it's just her making it.
Right.
But I put the recipe for it or a version of it, I will say, in my first cookbook and Small Victories. And then I did actually like a vegan version of it with kidney beans in my new book and Simply Julia instead of chicken. It's really good. Like both of them are really, really good. I make both versions often, and neither of them are as good as Jenny's, and that's okay. I'm okay with that.
That's so funny. Oh, that's
Yeah.
so funny. That's a great memory. And
Yeah.
that's I love that. I love that. Well, I am so grateful for this conversation and it's and having your book and also like now being in this food world that I've just entrenched
Hmm.
myself in the last year, like it's been really so liberating to like be okay with eating and be
Mm.
okay with enjoying food for pleasure and not just for nutrition, right?
Yeah.
So I really appreciate like you and your recipes and
Mm.
you fostering this conversation too around just enjoying food. So thank you so much and thank
No, thank you
you for
so
having.
much. This
Yeah.
was really like a pleasure. I'm really glad we did this. And also, I apologize that I didn't realize it was video, but I'm so I do not mind sharing it. I just want to say for anyone watching, like, I'm not actually like in a tanning bed. I don't know what's happening with this. So our living room is painted pink, and this lamp at this hour, just, I don't know what's happening here, but
So good.
I feel
I
like,
like the idea of you doing this in a tanning booth, though. That would be great.
like, I don't know what's happening here, but I'm glad that we got to do this face to face. I think
Me
it,
too.
you know,
Me
it makes
too.
for a different conversation. So I appreciate it. I'm just like, sorry I
Absolutely.
wasn't set up better, but whatever. This is
No,
my real life. So there you go.
exactly. No, thank you so, so much.
Thank
But
you so much. Have a
of
good night.
course, take care. Bye, bye, bye.
Bye.